Don't cry, sir. My mom will save you. The child was 5. She had no concept of dukes or titles or the weight they carried. All she understood was that a man lay bleeding in the grass, that he was fighting with everything he had not to let it show, and that somewhere beyond the far edge of the field, men were already being paid to track her down. She didn't know that last part yet. She only knew her mother could mend anything. And she was right. She was almost always right. If you have never watched a man who commands the whole of his world finally lose his grip on the one thing he cannot govern, keep listening. It happens in Chapter 3. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell us, what would you have done if you were June? Autumn in the year 1820 arrived in Wiltshire the way it always had, without apology. One morning the air held only a mild chill. By the next, it carried the bladed promise of frost, spilling down from the hills in gray curtains that pressed the grass flat and stripped the oaks of their final dignity. The fields surrounding Ashwick, that broad, half-untamed sweep of country lying between the Duke of Thorne's estate and the village of Coombe Hadley, had turned the shade of tarnished copper, lovely and lifeless at once. Pip Whitby had been instructed no fewer than 4 separate times that week that she was absolutely not to wander those fields alone. She was 5 years old. She received this prohibition the way she received most of her mother's rules, with gravity for roughly 3 minutes, then with none at all. It was not quite defiance. It was something closer to this. Pip owned an imagination so fierce it operated like a second set of senses entirely. She heard melodies woven through the wind. She traced shapes along the ridgeline. She felt, on that particular Tuesday morning in October, that something of consequence waited for her past the stone wall bordering their cottage garden, something that required discovering. She was not wrong. He lay face down at the foot of a shallow embankment, half swallowed by the tall amber grass the previous night's rain had beaten flat. His horse, a magnificent dark animal that had evidently formed its own opinion about the matter, stood some 20 yards off, grazing with towering indifference. The man's coat was of a quality Pip had never encountered at close range. Deep charcoal wool, impeccably tailored, now streaked with mud and torn open at the shoulder. One boot was gone entirely. His right hand pressed flat against the earth as if he had been trying, and failing, to force himself upright. Pip approached the way she approached most things, directly, without pause, her head tilted at a precise angle of inquiry. She dropped to a crouch beside him. He was breathing. She could track the rise and fall of his back, slow, labored. Blood darkened his temple, drying brown at the edges. His jaw was locked tight, even in unconsciousness, which Pip found remarkable. Most people looked soft when they slept. This man looked as though he were waging an argument with someone inside his dreams. She placed her small hand on his shoulder and shook him with tremendous purpose. He produced a sound caught somewhere between a groan and a word, and his eyes opened. Unfocused at first, then sharpening into something near alarm as they landed on the face of a child, gazing down at him with perfect calm. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, scraped raw by pain and by the specific shock of a man who had never once, in 34 years of living, been discovered at a disadvantage. He demanded to know what on earth she was doing out here. Pip informed him, without a shred of drama, that she was finding him. A beat of silence hung between them. He blinked. Something shifted across his face. She would not have possessed a word for it then. But years later, much later, she would recognize it as the first fracture in a wall that had taken a lifetime to construct. He attempted to move. The sound that escaped him was one Pip had only ever heard from wounded animals. She returned her hand to his shoulder, not to hold him down, but with a steadiness that was uncanny in someone so small. She told him not to try that again. She told him he was hurt. She told him her mother was a healer and that she would fetch her right now. And then, because she could see something in his face she recognized, that particular tightening around the eyes that meant a person was terrified, but would sooner die than admit it, she spoke the words that would first be repeated in whispers, then in drawing rooms, then inside the particular mythology that gathers around love stories told long after the living of them. Don't cry, sir. My mom will save you. Benedict Thorne, 5th Duke of Thorne, lord of Ashwick Hall and 12,000 acres of Wiltshire farmland, had not wept since the age of 9. He had no plans to begin now, but something in the absolute conviction carried by that small voice made it impossible to say as much. He simply looked at her. This remarkable child with mud caking her boots and utter certainty shining in her eyes. He said nothing at all. Pip nodded as if his silence were consent. Then she rose, smoothed her coat with immense dignity, and ran. June Whitby had been awake since before dawn. This was nothing new. Over the past several years, she had trained herself to sleep in the shallows, never the deep, half listening always for Pip, for a knock at the door, for that specific quality of silence that meant something had gone wrong. She was 28 years old. She had understood early that rest, like most luxuries, was not always something she could afford. She was at her work table when Pip came through the garden gate at a speed that signaled either excitement or catastrophe. With Pip, the distinction was often impossible to draw. The door flew open. The child's cheeks blazed scarlet, her breath arriving in vast, shuddering gusts, her eyes wide with the enormity of what she'd discovered. June was already in motion before the explanation reached its midpoint. She seized her kit, the leather satchel she kept packed and waiting, because in Coombe Hadley, someone always needed her, and was through the door with her cloak half-fastened and Pip's hand locked in hers. The child talked without pause the entire way, a man, very large, lying in the Ashwick field. His horse stood nearby, but he could not rise. Blood on his head, he was trying very hard not to appear frightened. June listened with the part of her mind that sorted facts and released the other part, the part already assessing, already cataloging, to race ahead. She was prepared for a great many things when she crested the embankment. She was not quite prepared for him, not because of his appearance, though she registered that too. The sheer breadth of him, the quality of the coat, that particular way a man of power holds himself, even while lying injured in a field with absolutely no command over the situation. What halted her, for just one half-breath, was the expression on his face the moment he saw her. She had been looked at in many ways throughout her life, with pity, with suspicion, with the specific cold appraisal of people who considered her profession an insult and her unmarried state a scandal. She had been dismissed, condescended to, spoken over by men who understood a fraction of what she knew about the interior workings of the human body. Benedict Thorne looked at her the way a man regards the sole candle burning in a dark room. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then his face shuttered closed, and he became whoever he ordinarily was. Formidable, contained, plainly accustomed to having his wishes met without question. He informed her, in a voice still carrying the ghost of authority despite his position on the ground, that it was entirely unnecessary for her to trouble herself. He was perfectly well. His man would arrive shortly. June placed her kit on the earth, knelt beside him, and offered no response to any of it. She simply took his wrist, 2 fingers pressed firm against the pulse point, and began to count. When she had what she needed, she moved to his head. She examined the wound at his temple with the steady detachment of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by the difference between a viscount and a carpenter when both were bleeding. He watched her work. She could feel it. That distinct quality of attention from a man unaccustomed to being the subject of scrutiny rather than its source. She told him he had a laceration at the right temple, bruised ribs along the left side. She pressed there, and his sharp intake of breath confirmed it. She suspected a sprained left ankle rather than a fracture, though she would need to examine it properly. She asked him to tell her the year. He replied, with magnificent irritation, that he was not addled. She told him to tell her the year regardless. He told her the year. He told her the month. He told her with considerable acid that he also knew the name of the Prime Minister and the distance from London to Edinburgh, and that he wanted to know precisely who she was and what she believed she was doing on his land. June settled back on her heels, met his gaze directly. It was the look she kept for patients who mistook belligerence for bravery. She gave him her name. She told him she lived in the cottage along the western border of the Ashwick grounds. She informed him that if he kept wasting her time with objections instead of letting her do what she came to do, the ankle would balloon to double its size before his man ever arrived. and she would have no choice but to slice through what was left of a very costly boot. Silence followed. Pip, who had been perched a careful 3 feet away, hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing the face of someone thoroughly enjoying a performance, announced cheerfully that she had told him her mother could fix. Benedict Thorne looked at the child, then at the woman kneeling beside him in an open field, sleeves already pushed past her elbows, satchel open, and not one flicker of submission in her posture. He said, with the reluctant exactness of a man who measured every word and rarely spent the ones that cost him, that she could proceed. June had already proceeded. She nodded without glancing up and carried on saving him. Benedict Thorne had come into his title at 19, his father taken by a fever that the finest physicians in London could not halt. Along with the dukedom came 12,000 acres, a moderate debt, 3 sisters who depended on him entirely, and a reputation as the most unreachable man across 3 counties. A reputation that had only deepened with time. It was not cruelty. Those who knew him, genuinely knew him, and that list was vanishingly short, understood the difference. He was not cold because coldness pleased him. He was cold because he had learned at 19 that warmth was exposure, and exposure carried a price. His father had been warm. His father had trusted freely. His father had offered his hand to men who clasped it, smiled broadly, and quietly engineered his destruction. Benedict had spent the years since setting things right. The debt cleared before he turned 30, the estate restored. His sisters, Cecily, the eldest, married to a respectable man in Bath, Eleanor, the middle one, who had no use for marriage and every use for horses, and young Harriet, just 17 and 1820, whose approaching bath season had become a source of considerable household dread. All of them settled, or settling. He had accomplished it through discipline, through precision, through an absolute, unwavering, almost terrifying insistence on control. The fall from his horse was, therefore, an insult. He had been riding the eastern boundary of the Ashwick property, something he did every Tuesday, a habit so rigid it bordered on ritual. A pheasant had burst from the grass directly beneath his horse's hooves. The animal, normally steady, named for a Roman general, had spooked hard to the left. Benedict had very nearly held his seat. Very nearly was not enough. He lay in that field for what seemed an eternity before the child discovered him. Long enough for rage to settle in. Long enough for something worse to gather beneath the rage. Not the pain that he could bear. The stillness. The impossibility of commanding his own body to rise and be finished with it. He had lain there and felt, for the first time in years beyond counting, utterly powerless. That powerlessness had pressed against his chest like a millstone. Then a 5-year-old with mud caking her boots crouched beside him, studied him as though he were a problem she fully meant to solve. And then her mother appeared. He was carried back to Ashwick Hall on a makeshift litter. Mrs. Pryor's face when she saw the condition of him, a masterwork of restrained horror. And June Whitby had accompanied him, because the ankle required proper binding and the wound required proper cleaning, and because she had, he would only recognize later, never once sought his permission. She had simply come. Kit slung over one shoulder, the child beside her, as though the possibility of his objection had never crossed her mind. It probably hadn't. He watched her work in the ground floor sitting room that Mrs. Pryor had transformed into something resembling a medical suite with remarkable speed. June moved through the space with a competence so absolute it bordered on aggression. She spoke to him while she worked, not with the measured deference people invariably offered in his presence, but in the direct clinical manner of someone who regarded him first as a patient and only distantly as a duke. In 34 years of life, that was entirely without precedent. Pip occupied a chair by the window, surveying every object in the room with the methodical precision of a very small naturalist. It was a strange, quiet standoff, one that could not possibly hold. At some point, she lifted a paperweight from the side table, a heavy piece of Venetian glass, and turned it over in her hands with careful reverence, then set it back in precisely the same spot, folded her hands in her lap again. Benedict, whose attention had wandered toward the child despite himself, heard his own voice asking how old she was. June answered without raising her eyes from his ankle. 5, she said. 6 in March. He asked, and could not entirely explain why, whether the child was always so serious. June glanced at Pip and something crossed her face. Something private, something vast, compressed immediately into a small, sideways smile. She said Pip was serious when she was thinking. The rest of the time, she was absolute chaos. Pip, from her chair by the window, said she preferred the word thorough. A brief silence followed, and then Benedict Thorne, who had not laughed in what felt like the better part of a year, who had found precious little cause for it, and had not particularly registered the absence until this precise moment, made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh. It startled him. It seemed to startle June as well. She looked up at him, quick and sharp, just once, then away. He found himself turning that look over in his mind long after she had gone. He did not intend to go back. The ankle mended, the laceration closed. Within a fortnight, he was riding again, a different horse, since the Roman general had been retired from active duty with some ceremony. And the incident in the field had taken on the quality of something that had happened to another version of himself, a temporary self, one that had lain horizontal in wet grass and been spoken to honestly by a woman who owed him precisely nothing. He thought about her more than was reasonable. He thought about the way she had pressed her fingers to his wrist to count his pulse, impersonal as a clockmaker, and how he had felt, absurdly, the warmth of that touch for hours afterward. He thought about her voice, direct, clear, with an occasional dry edge suggesting she found certain things very slightly amusing, but considered it unprofessional to say so. He thought about Pip by the window with the paperweight, so careful and so grave. He rode to Bath to see a solicitor. He attended to correspondence that had accumulated during his convalescence, reviewed the accounts for the home farm, approved a new drainage scheme for the eastern fields, wrote a lengthy letter to his sister Cecily, addressing, with considerable diplomacy, the question of Harriet's upcoming season. He was extraordinarily busy. He thought about June Whitby constantly. On the third week after the accident, he appeared at her door. He had told himself, riding over, that he was there to pay her properly for her services. She had refused any payment at the time, a refusal that had both irritated and unsettled him. A concluded transaction left no obligation. An unpaid debt had a way of persisting. He carried the payment in his coat pocket. That was the reason. He had a reason. The door was opened by Pip. She regarded him with the same expression she had worn in the field, complete, assessing calm, and said without inflection that he was the man from the grass. He confirmed that he was. She considered this, then stepped back and held the door open with the solemnity of someone performing a ceremony of great civic importance. He ducked his head to enter. The cottage had been built for people of ordinary height. He was not ordinary height, and he found himself inside a space entirely unlike any interior he had occupied in recent memory. Small, not elegant, but so thoroughly and specifically inhabited that it felt almost like a living thing. Herbs drying in bunches from the low beams, books stacked in a system that appeared to follow a logic all their own, by frequency of use perhaps, or by some system only June herself understood. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall beside the window. A house, a woman, a small figure that might have been Pip herself, rendered with remarkable detail for someone her age. A work table held 4 different mortars and a collection of glass vials sealed with wax. June emerged from the back of the cottage, drying her hands on a cloth. She stopped when she saw him. No fluster, just the briefest pause of someone recalibrating. He told her he had come to pay her. He named a figure. She opened her mouth to protest, and he told her quietly, but with unmistakable finality, that her objection did not interest him. A short silence. Then she said he could leave the payment on the table. She would make tea if he was willing to wait, because Pip had been asking questions about him since the accident. June thought it better he answer them himself, rather than leave the child to invent her own answers, which Pip was entirely capable of doing. And the results, she said, were sometimes alarming. He was willing to wait. Pip had been sitting at the work table pretending to read a book that was quite obviously upside down. She set it aside immediately and arranged herself with great intentionality across the table from him. Without preamble, she asked why he had been riding alone if he knew pheasants lived in that field. He said he had ridden that boundary every Tuesday for 11 years without incident. Pip pointed out, with the inexorable logic of the very young, that past safety did not guarantee future safety. Perhaps he should bring someone along, or look where he was going. From the back of the cottage came a sound that was not quite a laugh. He stayed for an hour. He had intended 10 minutes. Walking back to where his groom waited with the horse, he found himself thinking about the following Tuesday with something he did not immediately recognize. It had been so long since he had felt anticipation that the sensation arrived without a name. Coombe Hadley was not a cruel village, but it was a small one, and small villages ran on information the way mills ran on water, constantly, and in only one direction. June had lived there 3 years, since she was 25. She had arrived with a child, no husband, and a satchel full of knowledge that local opinion could not decide whether to be grateful for or suspicious of. The suspicious faction had largely surrendered after she set the blacksmith's dislocated shoulder at 2 in the morning without flinching, and then saved the miller's wife from a fever that had been moving in the wrong direction for 4 days. The grateful faction required rather less convincing, but the questions persisted. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she learned what she knew? Whether a woman alone with a child and opinions about medicine was entirely to be trusted. These questions were asked with varying degrees of kindness. June had learned to answer them with as little information as possible. She kept her history small and her presence useful. The Duke's visits, therefore, did not go unnoticed. He came again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He was always formally dressed. That was simply how he was. He knocked with a precision that suggested he had considered the correct force of a knock and arrived at a decision. They spoke about medicine at first. He had questions regarding the treatment of his tenants' ailments. A pragmatic interest. A sick tenant was an unproductive one. She answered without condescension and without false modesty about the limits of her knowledge. Then they spoke about other things. He held strong opinions about agricultural drainage that were, she discovered, grounded in genuine expertise. She had views on the responsibility of landowners to their tenants that were equally grounded and considerably more pointed. They disagreed on several matters of principle. Those disagreements had a quality she noticed. They sharpened both of them. She left those conversations feeling more awake than before, and she suspected, from the way he leaned forward when she raised a point he hadn't considered, that he felt something similar. Pip inserted herself into these visits with complete confidence. She had made her decision with the unshakable certainty only a child possesses. She liked the Duke. Pip asked him questions with the bluntness of someone who had never learned to fear powerful men. She showed him her drawings. She explained, at truly remarkable length, her theory that the starlings massing in the field at dusk were communicating something precise, something she fully intended to decode. Benedict received all of this with a seriousness Pip found perfectly appropriate. He told her that starling murmurations remained one of the least understood phenomena in the natural world. Pip said she was aware. That was exactly why she would be the one to understand them. He did not tell her she couldn't. June noticed this. She noticed everything about the way he behaved with Pip. The absence of condescension. The way he answered her directly, not in the flattened, careful register most grown men adopted with children. It revealed things about him that his public reputation had utterly failed to communicate. The village noticed all of it. The village talked. June let it talk. She had long since accepted that she could not govern what people said about her. She could only govern what she did, and she was doing nothing she felt ashamed of. She was, however, doing something that had begun to frighten her. She was falling. She had never told him about Pip, not in the way that required telling. He knew the child was hers. She had said so in the field, and he had never questioned it, because people rarely questioned the obvious. A woman with a child was the child's mother, the most natural assumption in the world. But Pip was not her daughter by blood. Pip was her daughter by choice, which was, June had always believed, a far more durable bond. Choice, however, was not something the law regarded with any particular generosity. In Wiltshire in 1820, it was not something society regarded at all. She had found Pip in Bristol in the winter of 1816. January, brutal that year. The cold had settled over the city like a second occupant. June had been working alongside a physician there, learning what she could through the informal apprenticeship that was the only path available to her. A colleague had asked her to examine a child in the charity ward, 4 months old, abandoned at the hospital door, fever, malnutrition, a rattle deep in the lungs that had the nurses speaking in hushed tones, the tones people use when they have already accepted the outcome. June had not accepted it. She sat with that child for 2 days without sleep. She did everything she knew, and some things she was not entirely sure of. On the third morning, the fever broke. The child looked up at her with dark, steady eyes that held, even then at 4 months, that quality of absolute attention. The same attention that would later have Pip cataloging the contents of a Duke's sitting room with the focus of a small scientist. She had not intended to keep her. She had intended to find a proper arrangement, something sanctioned. But the arrangements that presented themselves did not suit June. Weeks became months, and by the spring of 1817, she had recognized that the question of what to do with Pip had resolved itself some time ago, without her explicit permission. She moved to Coombe Hadley in the summer of 1817. Pip was not yet 2. Bath was too expensive. Bristol was too full of people who knew her history. Wiltshire lay far enough from both to offer something like a clean beginning. She built her practice quietly, made herself useful. She constructed a life that was narrow in certain respects, but entirely her own. She had also overheard her name once, in a corridor in Bristol, a conversation not meant for her ears. A lord's name, a man of consequence who had arranged for an inconvenient child to vanish. She had never confirmed it. She had decided that knowing precisely was not worth the danger confirmation would invite. She had not told Benedict any of this, partly because the moment had never arisen naturally, partly because she was uncertain how a man of his position would receive it, and partly, this was the part she was least proud of, because she liked the way things were. She was afraid of what the truth might do to them. She should have told him before anyone else could. She did not tell him in time. They came on a Wednesday in November, 2 men in a hired carriage. Unremarkable in every way except one, the precision of their questions. They moved through the village asking about June Whitby, about the child, about where they had come from and how long they had stayed. Mrs. Alcott at the post office delivered the news that same afternoon. She wore the careful expression of a woman who genuinely likes the person she is about to wound. Quote 3, quote, she said. Quote 4, quote 5, quote. June kept her face perfectly controlled. She thanked Mrs. Alcott. She walked home at her usual pace, locked the door, sat at her work table, and thought with great deliberation about what this meant. She believed it meant the name she had overheard once in a corridor in Bristol had finally caught up with her. She did not go to Benedict straight away. She was not yet certain what the men wanted, how much they knew, and telling him would require telling him everything. She had not yet assembled the language for everything. What she failed to account for was the nature of a village with 300 souls. Word of 2 strangers asking questions about the Duke's particular friend reached Ashwick Hall before those strangers had finished their evening meal. He appeared at her door that night. Pip was asleep. June opened the door and read his face and understood from the quality of his stillness that he already knew something was wrong. Not the specifics, the shape of it. She stepped aside. He entered. She lit a second candle. They sat across from each other at the work table in that small circle of light, and she told him everything. Bristol, the charity ward, the fever and the 2 sleepless days, the woman who had brought Pip in weeping, with nowhere left to turn. The name June had heard once in a corridor and never spoken aloud. She told him about the move to Wiltshire when Pip was not yet 2, the life she had constructed, the calculations she had run, that distance and silence were the strongest shield she could offer herself and the child. She told him she was sorry she had not spoken sooner, that she had been afraid, that she was telling him now out of necessity, not because she was asking him for. She was extremely clear on that final point. She was not asking him for anything. He sat in silence for a long while after she finished. The candle flame bent in some draught neither of them could trace. The cottage settled around them with small creaks and sighs. From the back room drifted the sound of Pip breathing, deep and even in her sleep. Entirely unbothered by the conversation being held about her future one wall away. He said at last that she was the most comprehensively infuriating person he had met in 34 years of living. His voice held no anger. It was the voice of a man saying one thing while meaning something else entirely, and not yet prepared to name it. She asked what he planned to do. He told her he planned to determine exactly who had dispatched the men, why they had come now, and what they were after. Then deal with it. He spoke with the flat conviction of a man for whom dealing with problems was simply what one did. Then, without meeting her eyes, he said there was something else he meant to address before he left. She waited. He said he did not wish to stop coming on Tuesdays. He said he found he could not quite bear the idea of this cottage and these books and Pip's theory about the Starlings becoming something he merely observed from a courteous distance before returning to his properly ordered life. He said, and this was the part that cost him most, she could see it in the rigid set of his jaw, that he was asking her permission to continue. Not to resolve anything, not yet, simply to continue. June regarded him for a long moment. She weighed what she was risking. She considered what she stood to lose if she refused. Not him exactly, she barely permitted herself that thought. But the Tuesday afternoons, the arguments about drainage, the way he listened to Pip with the same careful attention he gave everything, as though no subject was too minor to deserve exactness. She said yes. He nodded. He rose. He put on his hat. At the door he turned and told her she should lock it properly tonight. He would be in Bath by first light. She said she knew how to lock a door. He said, with the ghost of something not quite a smile, that she knew how to do most things. That it had been one of the first things he'd noticed about her. Then he was gone. June locked the door. She sat back down at the work table and let herself stay with it. The fear about the men, the uncertainty of what came next. And beneath all of it, persistent and inconvenient and entirely her own, something that felt alarmingly like hope. What Benedict did next required two things: the accumulated authority of a title 5 generations deep, and the particular coldness he had always been criticized for, which now, finally, served a purpose he did not regret. He spent the morning in Bath with Hartwell, his solicitor, a man of 20 years' loyal service who understood without being told that certain inquiries needed to happen swiftly and without leaving any kind of public record. By early afternoon, Benedict had the name he needed. By evening, he had confirmed it. The men had been dispatched by a solicitor acting on behalf of a lord's estate, a lord who had died in July of 1820, 3 months before those strangers appeared in Coombe Hadley. The dead man had left his affairs in chaos. A posthumous investigation had uncovered an irregularity. A child, an arrangement made in haste, carried out without the family's full knowledge. The deceased's younger brother, the one who stood to inherit, whose accountants grew nervous at anything that might complicate the claim, had commissioned a quiet search. He wanted the loose thread found and, if possible, cut. In the end, it had nothing to do with Pip, not truly. It was about a dead man's secrets and a frightened brother's money. Benedict sent a note that evening requesting a meeting in Bath the following morning. He phrased it as an invitation. It was not one. The brother arrived precisely on time. Men always did when a duke was the one summoning them. Benedict received him in the private dining room of the finest hotel in Bath, reserved specifically so there would be no witnesses. The man was perhaps 40, soft in the way men grow soft when they have never lacked for anything. He had the anxious eyes of someone who had spent months expecting bad news and receiving it in installments. He sat across from Benedict, introduced himself, and said he understood they had a matter of mutual interest. Benedict regarded him through a long, perfectly calibrated silence. Then he spoke, with the precision of a man who had rehearsed nothing, because nothing required rehearsing. The child in question was under his personal protection. She would shortly be under his legal guardianship. Any further inquiries directed at the village of Coombe Hadley, at Miss June Whitby, or at anyone connected to either would be treated as direct interference in his affairs. He was confident the brother grasped what that meant. He let the silence stretch again. The brother grasped it. The color drained from his face entirely. He said carefully that he had no desire to create difficulties for a man of Benedict's standing. He said the matter could be considered closed. He expressed hope that Benedict would extend him the same courtesy of discretion he was prepared to offer in return. Benedict said discretion was exactly his intention, provided the men never returned to Wiltshire. They did not return to Wiltshire. He rode back to Coombe Hadley that afternoon and told June everything. He told it plainly, without drama. The facts, the outcome, the assurance. She listened with her hands pressed flat against the work table, her face perfectly still. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, almost to herself, that she had spent 3 years waiting for it to find her. He said it was finished now. She looked at him, something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, not in the manner of a woman coming apart, but in the way of someone who has carried a weight for a very long time, and has just, for the first time, been allowed to set it down. Her shoulders dropped by half an inch. Her breath left her slowly. She said, quietly, quote 6. He told her there was something else he wanted to say. And then he proposed. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, beginning with the practical consideration, because it was real, and he was not a man who ignored reality, and then moving past it to the thing underneath. He told her that if she became his wife, Pip would be his ward by law, shielded from any posthumous reckoning over a dead man's mistakes. He told her that was a practical matter, not the sole reason he was asking, and he wanted no ambiguity on that point. He said he wanted to keep coming on Tuesdays. He wanted to argue about things that mattered and be corrected when he was wrong. He wanted to watch Pip catalog the world with that extraordinary gravity of hers. He said he understood how little warmth he had offered anyone over the course of his life. He could not promise to become a different man, but the man he was had discovered, since October, that Tuesday afternoons in a small cottage in Wiltshire were the finest hours of his week, and that this struck him as significant. He stopped. He had spoken longer than he meant to. He felt exposed in a way the open field and the wet grass and the cracked ribs had never managed, because those had been injuries of the body, and he knew how to weather those. This was the sort of exposure that permitted no defense. June told him to say it again. Without the practical consideration at the front, she was perfectly capable of protecting Pip on her own, and she needed to know the rest of it was real, not merely a solution hunting for a problem. He looked at her, drew one breath. He said the rest of it was more real than anything he had spoken aloud in years. That it was this room and the drying herbs and the books in their baffling order, and the way she pressed 2 fingers to a pulse point with the detachment of a clockmaker. That it was the way she had looked at him in the field, not with fear, not with calculation, but simply as a person who needed tending. He said no one had looked at him that way since he was 19. He had not understood until recently what the absence had cost him. She went very still. Then she said, yes. The wedding was fixed for the 3rd week of December. In the days before it, the village of Coombe Hadley carried on with the barely suppressed excitement of a community that had decided collectively to be pleased. Mrs. Alcott reorganized the post office twice for no discernible reason. The blacksmith's wife appeared at June's door bearing a cake and the expression of someone delivering a judgment she was satisfied with. Eleanor Thorne rode over from Ashwick and spent an afternoon with June talking about horses, latitude, and the particular tyranny of social obligation. By the end of it, June felt quietly that she had gained a sister. She did not feel quiet the night before. Pip had been asleep 2 hours, exhausted by the thrill of a new dress and the lengthy negotiation over whether her notebook could accompany her to the church, resolved diplomatically. The cottage was still. June sat at her work table with a candle in her hands and the stubborn company of her own thoughts, which were offering nothing useful. She was not afraid of the decision. She was certain of it. What frightened her was the scale of what she was walking into. The hall, the name, the weight of his world pressing against the borders of the life she had built so carefully in this small space. She was afraid of disappearing into the administration of a larger life. She had seen it happen to women. Watched competence sour into obligation, and obligation into invisibility. She was still sitting with that fear when she heard the knock. She recognized it. Precise, deliberate. His. She opened the door and found him standing in the cold December dark, hatless, wearing the expression of a man who had resolved to do something and would not be turned from it. She stepped back. He came in, ducking his head with the ease of someone who had done it many times, and stood in the center of her small kitchen and looked at her. He said he could not sleep. She said neither could she. He asked what was keeping her awake. She told him everything. The fear of losing herself, of her life reshaping beyond recognition, of whether she would still be allowed to work, to disagree, to remain the person she had forged herself into across 3 years of stubborn, solitary effort. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, because she had resolved some time back that if she could not speak the honest thing to him, the whole venture was already forfeit. He listened without cutting in. She had marked this about him and treasured it. He listened the way he did all things, completely, without splitting his focus. When she finished, he was silent a moment. Then he said he had not proposed to some diminished version of her, something lesser than the woman standing before him now, that he had no interest in a wife who had quieted herself for the sake of his ease, that the disputes over drainage and the interrupted suppers and the tenants turning up at whichever door she happened to be nearest, these were not disruptions he was willing to endure. They were the reason. They were precisely what he had been proposing to. He said he needed her to remain exactly herself, because he had spent 11 years surrounded by people who agreed with him, and it had made him worse than he might otherwise have been. He had only recently come to understand this. June held his gaze for a long, steady moment. The candle between them wavered in a draft, then righted itself. She crossed the narrow space separating them and pressed her hand to his jaw. Not the practiced 2 fingers against a pulse point, the full warmth of her palm, the way a person touches someone they intend to hold on to. He went absolutely still. The same stillness that had overtaken him in the field when the child laid her hand upon his shoulder, as though he had needed someone to stop him and had not known it until it happened. His hand rose and settled over hers. Nothing more than that. His eyes closed briefly. She said very quietly that she believed him. He turned his head just far enough to press his lips against her palm. Brief, deliberate, the first gesture of its kind between them. And in that very restraint, it carried more gravity than anything longer ever could have. He told her she should sleep, that tomorrow would demand her to be relentlessly capable, which was simply her natural condition, but that it would also demand a measure of patience with his youngest sister, who wept at ceremonies and afterward denied it fiercely. June laughed. The dread that had lodged in her chest since sundown shifted, not vanished, but smaller now, the kind a person could carry. He left. She locked the door. She went to bed and slept. They told Pip together the morning after Benedict's proposal. At the work table with toast and the drawing she had been laboring over for 3 weeks spread out between them. She was sketching the starlings again, trying to catch the shape of the murmuration, the way 10,000 birds moved as one, the mathematics of it, the beauty that was also a species of logic. June sat beside her. Benedict sat across from them both. June explained in plain, honest terms what had happened, what they had decided, what it would mean for the 3 of them. Pip listened to every word without interrupting, which was uncommon enough to suggest she was weighing something of real magnitude. When June finished, silence settled over the table. Then Pip turned to Benedict directly, that level, ancient gaze of hers. She asked whether he was going to be her father. He said, carefully, that he would like that very much, if she would allow it. Pip weighed this. She asked whether he would come to the field when the starlings gathered at dusk. She needed a second observer to record from a different vantage point. Her mother's handwriting lacked the precision the task required. He said he would come to every dusk she needed him. She asked whether he would go on letting her pose questions even when they proved inconvenient. He said, and June could see it cost him nothing, which told her more than 100 sworn declarations ever could, that her questions were never inconvenient, that they were, in truth, the kind of questions the world needed a great deal more of. Pip studied her drawing. She looked at her mother. She looked at the Duke with the gravity of someone delivering a verdict. All right, then she returned to her starlings. June met Benedict's eyes across the table. He looked, in that moment, like a man who had just been handed something he had not realized was missing, startled by the heft of it, quietly undone in the best way a person can be. She understood the feeling entirely. They were married on the 21st of December, 1820, inside the small stone church at Coombe Hadley. Frost had turned every blade of grass in the churchyard to silver. The sky hung pale and washed blue, the color midwinter keeps for its quietest mornings. It was not a grand ceremony. Grand ceremonies had never suited June, and Benedict, she had come to understand, carried a complicated weariness toward performance. Not discomfort in public, but a bone-deep fatigue with ritual conducted for spectacle rather than meaning. Eleanor arrived on horseback. Harriet came by carriage, whispering to her maid the entire walk to the church door that she was absolutely not going to cry. Cecily sent a letter from Bath, 4 pages long. It ended with the declaration that she had spent years waiting for Benedict to stop being impossible about his independence, and was exceedingly pleased he had found someone willing to share the burden. June's side of the church was smaller. Mrs. Alcott from the post office, the blacksmith and his wife, the miller's wife, recovered now, pink-cheeked, her husband's hand clasped in hers. 2 women from the village who had carried their children to June in the darkest hours and received them back whole. These were her people, not grand, not titled, entirely real. Pip stood at June's side in a dress she had approved after careful inspection. She held a small bunch of winter greenery, holly and rosemary, her own selection, gripped with the gravity of someone discharging a duty of great civic importance. When the vicar reached the relevant moment, Benedict took June's hand. She felt the warmth of his grip, steady, deliberate, the same quality of attention he carried into everything. And she thought, briefly and completely, of the night before, his lips pressed to her palm, the fear that had shrunk into something she could hold. He spoke his words with precision, as if he had weighed each one separately and arrived at it through genuine thought rather than convention. When he finished, the way he looked at her was unlike anything she had seen from him before. Not the candle in a dark room flash of the field, not the controlled attention of the cottage visits. Something settled. Something that had made its decision and rested now in the full weight of it. She said her own words back clearly, without hesitation. Pip, at this point, nodded once. The nod of someone confirming that proceedings were proceeding correctly. Behind them, from Eleanor's pew, came a sound that was absolutely not a sniffle. A year on, the Ashwick fields were copper again. Pip was 6 now, nearly 7, a fact she monitored with considerable attention to the calendar. She had her notebook, a proper one, bound in dark green leather. Benedict had produced it on her birthday in a manner suggesting he had thought about it well in advance, ordered it specifically, and was not going to make a great deal of it. 31 pages she had filled with observations about the Starlings, rendered in a hand already more precise than most adults could manage. They were in the field at dusk, the 3 of them. Benedict stood with his own notebook. He had accepted the recording responsibilities without ceremony, characteristic of him, and was noting the time and direction of the murmuration's opening movement. Pip stationed herself 15 yards away. At the angle she had calculated gave the best differential perspective. Doing the same. June stood between them. The sky above Ashwick was doing what Wiltshire skies did best in October, burning itself out in orange and violet, slow and total, indifferent to the humans standing beneath it. The Starlings arrived from the east, thousands of them, folding and unfolding over the field in shapes that were almost geometric and never quite. Every evening it was the same, both ordinary and impossible. Benedict came to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers. He did this now without ceremony, the easy proximity of a man who had decided, comprehensively, where he belonged. She leaned into him by half an inch. He leaned back. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Across the field, Pip wrote furiously, face bent over the notebook, the wool of her scarf trailing through the grass. She had a theory about the murmuration now. She had presented it at dinner the previous week with diagrams, standing on her chair for emphasis. It had to do with pressure gradients, the way each bird answered only its 7 nearest neighbors, and how that produced something that resembled intent, but was, in truth, far more fascinating. Something purely reactive, purely present, purely alive to the single instant it occupied. Benedict had posed 3 exact questions. June had proposed a method of testing. Pip had listened to them both and announced she'd already devised something superior. She was not yet 7. She was already a full year ahead of the 2 adults beside her. The flock turned, every bird all at once, that staggering collective pivot, and the dying light caught their wings and struck them silver. June felt Benedict's hand close around hers. She thought about the same field a year ago, the large man lying in wet grass, trying desperately not to look afraid. The small child who had found him and been wholly unimpressed by his rank and wholly certain her mother could mend whatever was broken. She thought about how a life assembles itself, never along the clean lines you draw for it, but sideways, in directions you never anticipated. Directions that begin with a pheasant and a startled horse, and a little girl with mud caking her boots, and absolute, unshakable faith in the people she loved. June tightened her grip on Benedict's hand. He pressed back. That particular pressure, a man saying something he no longer required language for. Something he had learned across the slow months of this year that he did not always need. For a man who had once operated entirely on precision and control, that was a remarkable thing to have discovered. Across the field, Pip glanced up from her notebook. She called out that the northern pivot was occurring 3 seconds earlier than last week, and that this was significant, and she required someone to confirm the time. Benedict called back. He had it recorded to the second. Pip said good, returned to writing. June laughed. The full kind, the unguarded kind. The kind she had rarely permitted herself in those long years of holding everything together alone. It came freely now, had been coming freely for months. The starlings wheeled again, and the sky went on burning. And the three of them remained in that field until the light bled out and darkness rolled in from the east, and the birds dissolved into it. 10,000 separate creatures becoming, for one more night, the single beautiful thing they made together. This was the life, not the one any of them had planned, not orderly, not arranged, not reached by the most direct route, but full, completely, stubbornly, irreversibly full. It turned out that was more than enough. If Benedict and June stayed with you, if Pip's confidence struck you somewhere you weren't expecting, subscribe and leave a comment. What would you have done in June's place? Said yes, or made him wait?